Hey everyone, it's John from the Obry Project. I'd like to take a quick minute before the video begins by reminding you that the only way that I can continue bringing you the high-quality, original, thought-provoking content that you've come to expect is through your support. So I'd like to encourage you to visit my Creator Spring page where there are many products to choose from with new designs and products being added all the time, as well as my Patreon page where you can choose tiers that offer either bi-weekly audios or weekly audios on various topics, as well as long-form and short-form articles with more content to come. In addition to these things, you can also choose to sponsor an Obry Project Briefs by sending a donation through Venmo or PayPal of $200 USD, along with the topic that you'd like to see me treat, as well as if you'd like to be credited or not in the video as sponsor, and if so, your name. And within 1 week, the brief that you sponsored will be published on YouTube. And lastly, there's always direct donations through either, again, PayPal or Venmo. And with that being said, I hope you benefit from and enjoy the following video. Hey everyone, it's 1:33 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. December 4th in the year that we're told, 2023. I think this is episode 52, but I'm going to try to count one more time, because I'm trying to keep these episodes numbered. I'm going to go back and I'm going to number them, because that's probably a good idea. Not just dating them, numbering them. So this one, this is not the easiest topic, because this is not a topic that many people talk about. Which, go figure. I'm hitting a topic that not many people, if anyone, really talks about. What a strange thing. So I'm going to do my best to be as succinct and coherent as possible, because I hope when I'm done, you'll see exactly what I'm saying. And it's a kind of a bit of a bummer, to be honest with you, but you know, the faster we understand the state of affairs, the better. So I was thinking, what really sparked this for me to make a briefs on this was that I had to check the sources of an article I read. And the sources were a couple of newspapers. They were like small local newspapers from way back when. They were November of 1914. And in fact, more accurately, I had to check November 23rd because of when the incident was supposed to have occurred. So the weird thing is, I started seeing all of these stories because during November of 1914, the world was said to be at war. That was supposed to have started in August of 1914. So there's all these articles on the war, and they kind of dominated most of this newspaper I'm reading, with just this smaller amount of local news. And I kind of got thinking about it, because I wanted to know, well, how do I verify the information that I was looking for, which was local? I started thinking, well, how do I verify that? Or how do I not verify it? How do I question it? How can I look at it critically? Because the thing is, especially when we go back, you know, that's over 100, that's like, 110 years ago. It becomes really tough to either accept or reject that information. And what we end up with, if we're looking for possible verification or non-verification of a claim, in large part, is oftentimes going to be newspapers, maybe public records, archives. A lot of that, though, if it's not like an official the minutes of an official town or city meeting of government or something like that, maybe you can look into records as far as like census, birth and death, things like that. But as far as what was actually happening, the events of that time, you're kind of largely stuck with newspapers. And unless there's something that I'm really not seeing, that is basically the equivalent of Google, YouTube, Facebook, because it's sort of all wrapped up into one when you look at those old newspapers. And as I went about thinking like, all right, well, I found this old newspaper. This one I actually found at Archive. Some of them you can find at like Library of Congress. And then once in a while you can find them in local historical societies or local libraries. Not always. So what I started thinking about was, if I want to really be sure, so let's say the information I was looking up on that article, I want to be really, really sure that happened, and that it happened in the way that these local, so isolated, I want to be really sure that these events happened in the way that these local sources say. How can I be sure? Because let's say I want to, we'll just say verify it. Now, I'm not looking to destroy it and say, see there, I've disproved it. But I'm not looking to absolutely prove it either. I'm looking for what the truth is. So I'm thinking, how can I figure that out? I want to be sure. Because all I have in front of me is a digital representation of something that is said to have been printed and distributed on November the 23rd, 1914. So I had to start looking into that. Turns out that there's kind of a story to all of this, and how our information of today about 100 or so years ago, and things get, by the way, things get super sketchy before that, before World War I. I mean, at about that time of World War I, things seemed to be far more solid, kind of across the board, as far as information of what was happening in the world and everything. You get before that, and it is a little sketchier. Not that you won't find newspapers, periodicals, things like that. It's just that the information on what was going on and why and all of that, just a little, in my opinion, weaker. Now, I'm going to go from that, and I'm going to make a sort of a hard right turn into a point that I would like to make before I continue in that vein of discussion. So what we're going to do for this exercise or illustration is we're going to assume, we have to suspend some disbelief, we got to assume a few things could be true. We're going to take all these stories that we've been hearing for months now about what they say is going on in, I hate calling it, you know what, say Palestine. So between the Jews and the Arabs or Palestinians, between Gaza and the state of Israel, we'll assume that the way that stuff is being reported is quasi-true and accurate, because the majority of people are treating it like it's pretty true and accurate. The majority. The whole point is this. If you had 4 different people, and you probably do, if you had 4 individuals that were paying attention to what's being told about that situation, and let's assume that none of them are controlled opposition, have, that none of them are professional agents, professional culture creators. Okay? 4 different individuals with 4 different point of views. That's what we're going to say. What we would expect to see is 4 dramatically different points of view, approaches, and perspectives on that. So let's say person number 1. They look at the news, they hear what's being said is going on, and for the most part they believe, and that's what we're going on, that these people, for the most part, they believe this is relatively accurate. So the first person might talk about all of this in context with his history of the state of Israel and the Palestinians since the turn of the 20th century. The politics of it all to the creation of the state of Israel, the need for suffering on both sides as a religio-political distraction to much bigger, much quieter, maybe much more important world events. Kind of similar to what I did in one of my recent briefs. Okay, that might be one person's perspective, how they're going to contextualize those events. Now, the next person, they might talk about the aggression of the Jews against not only the Palestinians, but all populations that they've come in contact with. So, i.e., maybe a personality like Christopher John Bjerknes, maybe a personality like Jim Rizzoli or Devin Stack. They might cite the Talmud and how the aggression of the Jews is all filled by their Talmudic worldview. And they'll adopt that entire perspective on all of this. And they'll adopt a certain particular historical narrative on the whole thing. Completely different point of view. The third person, they might talk about the Palestinians as the Philistines and how Israel is constantly under assault. How this is moving us all towards the rapture or other fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Now, unfortunately, I know that there's plenty of controlled opposition that are talking about these points of view, but there could be completely uncontrolled people who really think that they're believing or thinking for themselves. That would have these very different points of view and approaches to the topic. And I'm not even coming close to how different the approach of these individuals would be. I'm just trying to make a basic illustration here. Now, the fourth person might talk about it as just people. Like, people are people no matter where you go. How it's unfortunate that no matter if it's there over in Palestine, in the Middle East, or if you're in the former state of Yugoslavia, which is now a number of countries, whether you're in Russia or Ukraine, or whether you're in the U.S. and various cities and places, regions of the U.S., that people they can't peacefully coexist. Because people are people. And there's your real problem. People are people and they just can't peacefully coexist. And they're going to boil it really maybe down to that. And they're going to say, the real problem here, besides the fact that, people just can't get along because of their religion or their politics or whatever it is that they try to claim is what's really wrong with people and their motivations and what they do. People are going to approach the same exact details of a story in radically different ways and radically different points of view. Now, unfortunately, I wish I could have picked something that would have been more like, I wish I could have picked something that was local, something that I had my hands on. Say if it was like a local thing where a local factory, there was an explosion at a local factory. And 4 different people who really had nothing to gain other than telling the story from their perspective would approach that in such very different ways. let's say one person, they knew people who worked there. And those people had told them all kinds of terrible things about the owners and the way they run the place and everything. And so their perspective would be based on a lot of the irresponsibility of the people who own and manage that place. And then another person's telling of all of that might be a very visceral account of literally the explosion because they heard it and they saw the aftermath of it, the fire and the smoke and the fire department and the people who were hurt. They would have such a radically different perspective. And if you could get a number of these different perspectives on the same very real thing that happened, just locally, you would see just how different it is when individuals with not anything in particular to gain, they're not trying, these individuals, they're not trying to get you to believe something that, say, they've all gotten together, had a meeting, and said, these are the talking points that we're going to hit and concentrate on so that everybody believes basically the same narrative. Now, we can fool with the details a bit. We can use a little bit different language. We can focus a little bit more on this thing. Like, you can focus a little more on this if you want. You can focus a little more on this if you want. But you stay inside this box. Stay inside these parameters. Keep with these talking points. Because this is the narrative we want people to hear. This is the only points we want people to be thinking about. If you didn't have that sort of a conscious effort beforehand and guiding the whole process through, you would have remarkably different perspectives on virtually any kind of incident, real or imagined, that happened. So now, with that sort of an idea in mind, I'd like to apply that to some of the biggest, not mainstream topics, because those are so obvious and I think so easy to prove how all of them are being pre-designed and pre-packaged with talking points, ironclad, worked out. That's easy. But let's put this in context with conspiratorial topics, the fringe topics. Maybe not the uber fringe topics, but probably the ones that most of you listening to this are going to be familiar with. And this isn't all of them, it's just a handful. And I want us to consider the possibility, or lack thereof, of all of these topics being very deliberately presented to us in a very small, very controlled, very preconceived package. Because if they are, then we have to consider why. And remember, what culture creators are doing, they are constantly keeping multiple steps in front of us. Now, I'm going to tell you very honestly, I don't yet understand what the cues are for them to introduce the topics they introduce. Some people speculate that certain topics are introduced just to distract a certain portion of certain demographics away from other more important topics. Some people would claim that. It's possible. I think that's possible. But I also think it's possible that they are able to, and probably, especially today, with the help of the internet and social media, all those apps, all that information that they're able to gather, run through machine learning filters. I think what they're able to do is, since mid-90s, when all of us started getting computers and electronic devices, they're starting to be able to far more accurately than before. Before, they would get this information, but they had to gather it through things like polls and Nielsen ratings, who's watching what, when, and they could get a great idea based on the information in a television show, based on information in specific kinds of publications, where people's heads were, and then they could gear what they were releasing news-wise based on that. Today they just have in my opinion, a far more accurate model or device, ways of collecting information on people and then knowing what they should dole out than they used to have many decades ago. So even while I agree that maybe some topics are out there just for distraction and division, I have to wonder if a number of these topics are really just them getting ahead of where they see, based on all of the information and the machine learning and the algorithms that they have, where they see certain things going that they don't like. So they get way in front of it, way ahead of it. I think that's why a lot of topics that I find as rollouts, which are mostly if you hear about a conspiratorial topic and a number of people are talking about it and they're not being shut down, or if you even hear about them, because I can't even keep track of all the information sources that have been shut down just like that. Even individuals that were kind of talking about the same thing as other conspiracy outlets who just were not anywhere near the talking points of the vast majority of the characters involved in that. Gone. So fast. I mean, the best ones. Gone so fast. And that doesn't mean I think that they necessarily disappear. That doesn't mean I think they necessarily were torpedoed off of YouTube or other places. But I do think they have ways of putting up barriers between, and again, based on information that we input, whether we're conscious of it or not, we are constantly feeding them information about ourselves. We're constantly feeding them information about our demographics. We're constantly feeding them information that is relevant to them based on our location, our language, and other things that they are using to keep people hungry for certain kinds of information away from those people who are actually talking about, let's say, organically talking about that information. And I think that's one reason that my channel, my YouTube channel, my main one, capped years ago and has never climbed since. Now, I've done some things they've helped that out, it capping and not climbing, like doing away with flamenco. I will have nothing to do with that stuff. Rejecting Christianity. That was a big hit for a lot of people. They did not like that, and I understand that. But those things happened years after I capped off. Okay? So, getting into a rabbit trail. But how about some of the big ones as far as conspiracies that we've seen in, we'll say, less than 10 years. 10 years or less, okay? So how about flat Earth? Now, there's going to be a lot of you listening that weren't really paying attention to YouTube back in 2015, which was a night and day different platform then. It was so radically different, YouTube was. Somebody could create like creative, original material, and it would get put in front of people that wanted to see it. It was very different just 8 years ago. So, I mean, for those of you who do remember, you know it was very different. However, it was still a platform that was used, in my opinion, to push the talking points of a preconceived narrative. Now, the image I got on the screen, this is supposed to be images from the whole Israel-Gaza conflict, and don't even worry about that. We're talking more about the message here, and I'm not going to throw up a bunch of flat earth things or whatever, but just follow me here. Flat Earth, 2015. What did we have? Well, in a very short amount of time, we had Mark Sargent with his Flat Earth Clues, where he claims, well, he had just been kind of poking around. And he decides, out of the blue, to sit down and in short order creates these number of episodes of Flat Earth Clues. And you can tell if you've used software on Windows that whoever made those, he definitely narrated them. Whoever made those deliberately made those in Windows Movie Maker, which was not really the greatest software, to make it look very grassroots, very organic, poor, absolute professional hit job. Flat Earth Clues. Mark Sargent was propelled very immediately into like internet radio and interviews, and he became just the face of in a lot of ways. Him, Eric Dubay. Eric Dubay all of a sudden had this Flat Earth conspiracy book, besides his Atlantean conspiracy book. And I went and I started digging into him actually for a while there back in maybe 2017, just to see what his background was, where he was coming from, what I could find of him, because he was a dick, by the way. He's a dick. He's probably still a dick to this day. Because back when he started his IFers, and he's got now these books and everything, and I've never heard of him. Yeah, so he's got IFers, and if you want to get into IFers, like I tried getting in there a couple of times, and him in a total dick way rejected me even getting into IFers. I had almost nothing like a presence on social media or anything, and he was deliberately running that site like an asshole. Which doesn't seem normal if he's trying to get a lot of people interested in Flat Earth. So you got Dubay. And then you've got a lot of people pushing Robotham, which is absolutely a talking points based book. His book, what was it? Zetetic Cosmology, or, you know. And then a few other characters that just immediately floated right to the top. Jeranism, another dick, just pushing these very certain specific talking points. Now, they would definitely fool around in the deep waters here and there, in the shallow waters here and there, little to the left, little to the right, but they basically kept the narrative a certain way. Now, you had people back then, because YouTube was such a very different platform, who were fringy. Now, you still have some people who are fringy, but nobody, hardly nobody, is going to come across them and hear about them today. I'm dead serious. If I wasn't already subscribed to a few of those people, I would never, ever, ever come across their channels. The people that you pretty much come across when you type in flat earth if they're not complete controlled opposition garbage, making you feel like you're stupid for thinking that it's a possibility, are extremely controlled opposition, talking points driven jackasses. People that want to go out in the middle of public with a megaphone and make an ass out of themselves with the same basic talking points, keeping your brain in the same little cage. Same talking points, same little cage, as if they're all working off a preconceived script that they're not allowed to deviate from. Little bit here and there. And I would imagine a number of those things, unless they were already established talking points from other times, they've got to get those things approved. Now, back around 2015, there were a number of channels. Couples still exist, but very, very, very few, who were taking a completely different approach to the subject. I mean, completely different. And they were smart. And the way they went about it was very unique, and some of them even genius. These were the people who disappeared. Now, I'm not saying the people themselves disappeared, but they're on social media, so I don't know who they are or where they went. But they went. That's the point. They went. Why? They have a very unique perspective on the issue, and they were making people really think. Because they were thinking, and they weren't thinking in the box of a controlled opposition, pre-established narrative. But who emerged and stayed strong even all these years later? Those fuckers that started and got the exposure, even on YouTube, even back then, from the start. Those are the ones still going to this day. Strange, isn't it? So yeah, if we fast forward to 2019, we can see something similar, except when we go to 2019, now we have YouTube extremely controlled. They've performed multiple house cleanings since 2015. The whole environment, the whole platform, radically different. And not just YouTube, of course. Twitter, Facebook, I mean, you name the social media platform and it was different. Okay, but everybody knows what happened 2019. And what we could see is there were still fringe voices here and there. These ones were much harder to find, and they got disappeared from media in general very quickly. So fast. This was not like 2015. So fast. People with very different points of view on what was going on and why. Gone. The prevailing points of view just came through very fast. And also, very few people talking about how this was directly affecting business and power in economy. Very, very few voices. Everything was, because people might say, well, wait a minute. There was a lot of different points of view out there regarding, the thing, the 1-9 thing. There were a lot of different people out there talking about, was it a virus? Do they even exist? Was it bacteria? There were people making very sophisticated videos on things like that. There were people talking about the problems with electron microscopy. There were people talking about how all of this was really just generated in a computer program. And there were all these people talking about the PCR tests and how bad they were. There were people talking about the kill rate and sickness rate of the national the website, and I don't remember the name of it. The purported properties of the different vaccines, the speculation on latency, speculation on things it was going to do to your body, words being thrown around like cytokine storm, but very few talking about, was there a sub-narrative, a subplot that had very little to do with this? Because the thing was, there was plenty of people that were getting ill. They were getting sick in hard to explain ways. And I mean really sick. And when you see people that are getting really sick in these really bizarre, weird ways, and you're not specifically addressing that, and all you're doing is saying things like 5G or radiation, and you can't really prove that, it's a problem. And there was nothing, no hard proof of anything in any of those vaccines. And I imagine that there was a reason for it. Remember, those were all released under like emergency acts and everything else. Nobody was really offering anything really hard on any of that. So nothing was gained. So even though it seemed like a lot of people were coming from a lot of different perspectives, like, well, there was a lot of different people saying a lot of different things. You can't say that it was just all a very controlled narrative. Well, I mean, I can. Yes, I can. Because they weren't talking about all of those potential sub-narratives that were going on. Very few were, if at all. Like the economic factor. I mean, now that we've emerged from that, everything is different. Not only the fact that certain businesses have lost out dramatically, a lot of businesses have entirely changed their whole business model. Like, because I was post-chemo and I couldn't work as a carpenter because at that time I had almost no strength. I was delivering pizza for a long time. In the place that I worked for, they, of course, had to shut their dining room down. But they got so much business over the phone because they were good people and they had a good place. They had good food. Yeah, I loved that place. But they changed their whole business model because they found it more advantageous to do it that way. And now you'll find that almost every place they want you to get an app. Put your orders in through an app. Or call and have a place like DoorDash. Just go and get it and they'll bring it to you. Everything's changing. Like the social aspect, the social fiber has changed so much in the world because of that. Not to mention the economic moves, which I'm not even fully aware of the economic moves. Because hardly anybody talking about the real effects of those economic moves. And I'm not talking about Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. I'm talking about the sub-narratives, what's really going on. And maybe the whole reason why, because they rolled that out. The whole thing, I'm not talking about, they rolled out all of the narratives of it. Including the vax and anti-vax narratives of it. And it's still so fresh that most of us don't even know what they were really doing while they were having all of their controlled opposition people doing what? Talking about the 1-9 thing, talking about all of the great conspiracies of the 1-9 thing and who's involved and who's maybe involved, and the vax thing. I know that most people out there, they didn't mention how many people were really getting sick in certain inexplicable and bizarre ways, or offer any kind of good, solid reasons for that, other than Really crazy speculation. I did some of that. Very few people really talked about how similar that was to what was going on pre-World War I, during World War I. Very similar all of this was to that. And I have every reason to believe that that was not the Spanish flu that was going on back then, that there was a lot of other things, let's just say, going on back then. But very similar. Like distancing us. They were distancing people back then. Encouraging people not to talk to one another because anybody could be a spy. Wearing masks. There's a terrible Spanish thing going on. All that. That was all going on back then. 110 years ago. Very few people even spent any kinds of time drawing all the parallels between then and now. Few, if any, related this to the potential of, here and there, aerosol poisoning in any sort of concrete way, because that's really hard to do. Or how about anyone talking about petroleum and petrochemicals and all of their effects on us in life? Very few have talked about that. And how profound those petrochemicals are. And it seems like no one considered the possibility that many of the vaccines could just, in reality, be antidotes to poisons introduced. Nobody seems to want to consider that. It's just one of those things that if you're approaching something like this from an independent point of view, it's something that you might consider. Well, hey, wait a minute. These anti-vax people, they have a hard time making their arguments stick. They really do, because there's so many vaccines that work. I didn't say they appear to work. There's so many vaccines that work. Based on the numbers that can't be skewed enough for you to say, well, that they're all wrong. There's many of them that work. Why has nobody even brought that up? The possibility that these things are just simply antidotes to introduced toxins, carcinogens, poisons. How about the fact that most of them, most of the ones during, the big 1-9 might have been complete placebos? Because we have no way of knowing. Why wouldn't they be? They might be. Nobody seemed to bring that up. And that a lot of them that end up going bad for people, who knows why they go bad for people? Maybe the people who have the power over those things can introduce carcinogens, toxins, other things in a sort of Russian roulette system. And no one would be any the wiser. But I never heard anybody bring that up either. These are just independent perspectives that people might have if they really were coming at these various topics from purely independent, purely original, and honest points of view, which I posit we heard next to no honest, unbiased, not trying to change, alter, and restrict the way you think points of view. How about another big one? Revisionism. Totally controlled opposition. That whole thing. Am I saying that every individual out there that is a revisionist or talks revisionism is controlled opposition? Look, I don't know that because I'm not personally around these people. I don't know most of these. I'm not around these people. But I have no more reason to believe they are authentic or genuine as to believe that they're total controlled opposition, enemy agent combatants. All I can do is look at what I see. That's all we can do. We can look at, is this person willing to accept new information? Are they willing Are they willing to entertain new information if it's got a little bit of meat to it? If it's got some claws? Because I guarantee you, if you have tried to talk to most of these people through email or any other vehicle, you will find most of them, like for instance in the case of Eric Dubé, total fucking dick. And most of those, the leaders of that, dicks. Like the leaders of the recent thing, the Big 1-9, you can't even really talk to these people. They're so far removed. They're not even like before the Flat Earth thing. Revisionism. So what do you got there? Two sides. That's it. That's it. You've got two different opinions, and that's it. You've got the leading narrative, which says, of course, that Hitler and the Nazis, along with the whole of the German people, by way of plebiscites, basically tried to take over the world and exterminate the Jews. That's it in a nutshell. What's the revisionist argument in a nutshell, as nutshell-y as I can, is that Hitler was a good guy. He was trying to save the German people, as though the German people were a people, like a monolithic, like a unified, like the same ethnic people. That's something else that's part of their narrative. That he was trying to save the German people, that Nazis were trying to save the German people, that they were the most noble and gallant warriors you've ever seen, and that, of course, no Jews were harmed, and they kept them in work camps and treated them wonderfully, and very decently, at least. And at the same time, there's really not a revisionist that exists that doesn't at the same time push the "it's the Jews" narrative. It's the Jews that are in control of everything. It's the Jews that are pulling all of these strings. And all of these terrible things were happening to Germany in the first place, pre-World War II, because of the Jews. Because the Jews were in charge of banking and law and education and all of these things. And Hitler and the Nazis saw that, and they rallied and fought hard against the terrible influence of the eternal Jew and guys like Erich Ludendorff and what's his name, Berg. Sorry, his name slips my mind. That actually wrote that book, I believe, The Eternal Jew. That they were rallying against this. They were just trying to fight these Jews that are in power because the Jews run the world, and that narrative goes hand in hand with the revisionist narrative. But who out there is coming at it from a far more unique point of view and at least speculating based on facts some very different possibilities? Which one of these revisionists, who, by the way, every single one of them will claim that is the most important topic there is. There's no other topic that comes even close to being as absolutely important as revisionism. So which one of them is willing to look at some really hard facts and admit the very big problem with some of these very hard facts? Who's willing to admit that there's far more evidence that, as opposed to the Nazis being in cahoots with the Jews, which I know voices like, for instance, and he's a minority voice, but you have to have minority voices like that. It really helps to sell a certain boxed-in perspective. You do have minority voices out there, like, for instance, Christopher John Bjerknes, who will speculate that the Nazis were in cahoots with or being run by the Jews. And all he's doing is he's putting it back into the "it's the Jews" category. But he's just changing who the Nazis were serving, who their masters were. That's all he's doing. But he's staying with the "it's the Jews" to cover for who it really is. So who is it that's willing to not only look at the evidence of how much the Jews were protected and well treated, and not say, because the Jews run everything, not say the Nazis were in cahoots with the Jews, but simply to point out that the Nazis were protecting the Jews, that they were put in all of these various camps where they were protected. Now, the revisionist will oftentimes says, oh, that's because they were so humane. But they weren't being humane to the Germans. They weren't being nearly as humane to the Germans. Now, if they were, and I'm not supporting anything that happened or is speculated as happening at all. It cannot be said I'm doing that at all. But I'm thinking this through. And I'm saying, look, if Hitler and the Nazis really were as pro-German as these revisionists say, there's no way they would have been treating the Jews as, let's say, quote-unquote, humanely, as the revisionists claim. They would be absolutely treating their own people, first and foremost, far better. But the evidence seems to suggest that what they were doing was protecting them. They were protecting them, they were enriching them, they were working either with them or with an outside party to preserve as many of them as they could in an uncomfortable situation, but a protected situation, to, for one thing, try to encourage as many of them as possible to move out to Palestine so that that whole situation could be grown in a very real and very fast way, because nobody wants to be in Palestine. I don't blame anybody who doesn't want to live there. Fuck's sakes, man. Get a load of the place. Who else out there is talking about what a problem it is if Hitler was supposed to be this great liberator, this champion of the German people? How he supposedly died hidden away in a bunker with a bullet to the head, or however they claim that he died. What a coward. Oh, he cared about the German people? Then why wasn't he out fighting for them? Fuck you if you claim that he was the champion of anybody but himself and those paying him, which I don't for a second believe was the Jews. Why aren't you talking about that? Why aren't you talking about why his body was never recovered? That burned, charred body didn't come close to matching what it should have looked like if it was him. Why was he a coward, hidden away? While not all the German people, and there's the next problem, not all the German people, but very specific people in very specific places were being harmed. How about the fact that many high up Nazi leaders seem to just disappear or have little to no really good solid proof of their bodies being identified, like positively, as those are their bodies? How about the fact that they want to justify the police state that existed prior to World War II as just, oh, because of the Jews running rampant? Oh, and I didn't get to the difference. So why aren't they talking about the fact that just after World War II, it wasn't, the whole country was not like other losses or Hellstorm, like the Allies and the Jews and everybody else, like they want to make it out like what's his name, the book that I read makes it out like it was all over the country and all the people. No, it wasn't. There was a certain segment of the population, likely certain demographics, who were part of the population, who were in abject poverty, who were being hurt, imprisoned in open-air prisons, raped, killed. A certain segment of them, Another segment, some have described it as nearly a half and half. So bizarre that some Germans, inexplicably so, because they're all called Germans, even though they clearly couldn't all be of the same ethnicity, some were living a nightmare, if they were living at all. And many others were still living comfortably and affluently and were not in the danger of harm whatsoever. That is mighty strange. And none of these voices seem to be talking much about that. Why is that? Well, if you want my opinion, the reason for that is because there were certain demographics present in what they call Germany, which is a silly made-up word. There is no such thing as Germans or Germany until they made it up. There were clans and tribes that presided over areas and territories, and there were clans and tribes that lived in certain territories, districts, and regions who were the poor slave worker class. That's who suffered. Who were they? Were they the Celts? Was it, in fact, Judah? Because that's what all the propaganda, that's what all the it wasn't even, there was no anti-Jewish propaganda in Germany. There was propaganda against Judah, not Jews, Judah. Those of the Galut, the Celts. There were different demographics in this place with a made-up name and a made-up language called Germany. But nobody's talking about that. So I don't care if they're mainstream or revisionist. They're keeping your thoughts and how you're going to look at all of the factors. Well, all of the factors that they'll let you know about. They're keeping all of that in a very tight, neat little box. So you don't think outside of it. Now, how about the U.S. or / world police state? And the way that certain internet talking heads, social media personalities present that to us. Because that's another conspiracy thing, depending on which way you go with that. I can tell you that the leading voices, how do they approach it? They approach it in the sense that, and I mean, there's different ways to do it, because some people will tell you that the people imposing this police state, well, there's some that'll tell you that it's the Jews, right? There's some that'll tell you that it's the Jesuits. There's some that'll tell you it's the cabal, it's the elites. There's others that'll tell you, well, it's just regular people that get into power, that abuse that power and abuse those laws, things like that. But here's what they keep coming back to, which is just bizarre, like across the board. They always keep coming back to comparing the police state and the way that police continually, ubiquitously rob and deprive people of their, and I hate this word, rights. But they always compare it to what? The Constitution. Even the people who purport to be like biblical law keepers, like Christian identity and that sort of thing, they do the same thing. They'll compare all of this to the Constitution. They'll tell you that what we need to go back to the Constitution, being constitutional. Constitution, Declaration of Independence, Magna Carta, and of course the whole time, they are absolutely, without a doubt, without fail, upholding establishment historical narratives too. Why do they want to keep our brains locked into the Constitution? Maybe it's so that we don't realize that, first off, the whole idea that there was a Constitution drafted in the late 1700s and ratified after the Civil War, that whole idea is provable, if you want to call it that, on paper only. And we're having to reach back even further than the 1800s, which is a serious problem. And if we want to go that route, which no one who purports to be an advocate of biblical law would uphold and support constitutionalism. Why is that? Well, first off, the Constitution of the United States and basically every other sort of Western democracy, they all have damn near the exact same Constitution, which should tell you one thing about whether or not the world is run by the same people thinking the same ways. The Constitution is not biblical law, and it has nothing to do with the covenants made with the descendants of Jacob. And it has nothing to do with any of the covenants or expectations from Yahweh to all of the other nations which happen to not be descendants of Jacob Israel. Because it's not as though Yahweh doesn't care about those other people. He happens to be using Jacob Israel as an example and entered into covenants with them that, as far as I know, are still in effect. And they've got nothing to do with any national constitution. They are completely and wholly different, separate, divorced from that. So besides the fact that no national constitution has anything to do with the law or the Bible, let's just say we're coming at it from just a purely secular point of view. What's the problem with the people who keep comparing the modern police state in light of the Constitution like that's our ideal, that's our model? Because none of them, like High Impact Flicks, he's one of the worst offenders when it comes to this. Or Audit the Audit, I don't care what outlet you're talking about, there's plenty of them. What they don't talk about is, for one thing, the Constitution's specific allowance for unlimited contract. Anyone out there may enter into any sort of contract, basically, with any other party, without the Constitution limiting that. And they never talk about all of these things they say are so unfair, so unlawful, such a violation of your, I hate this word, rights, as it pertains to you being involved in contracts. Oftentimes they are contracts that you're not aware of. You didn't enter into willingly. I understand that. But they're not making you aware of all of these contracts that you have entered into unwillingly, unknowingly, unintentionally. What the implications of that are. And there's certainly, above all, they're certainly not pointing the finger at you and telling you that you really are a big part of this problem. Sure, there's plenty to that that's based on nescience. I understand that. But there's a hell of a lot to it that's based on ignorance too. What's the difference? Ignorance, the root, ignore. People not paying attention. These people are never telling you that it's probably your fault. At least part of it, or maybe a good deal of it, your fault. None of them are telling you that probably the reason that you live as a slave, and you are a slave, very few, even mentioning that, you're a slave. Because they don't want you to know that there is a huge demographic out there that is indeed children of Jacob Israel. And I don't mean white people. I mean a small portion of a race. Not all of that race can possibly be Jacob Israel. A portion, a certain demographic layer, who are abject slaves, who have a glass ceiling about 1 foot above their head, And they are in that condition because, for one thing, they are continuing to willingly enter into these contracts and agreements. Even though they don't always know about them, they are willing to take the quote-unquote benefits of them. They're willing to ignore all kinds of problems with the biggest idolatrous system I think the world may have ever seen. And I am talking about Christianity. And those people in CI, Christian identity, of course, they're never willing to talk about all of the problems between the New Testament and the Old Testament. In concept, in the technical aspects of the language, in how much it even makes sense. I mean, even if at the end of the day, they decided they still wanted to stick with Christianity, none of them are willing to even bring the stuff up and air it out. Think about that. Do you really think they're that honest if they're not willing to do that? If they even approach the topic, they're going to come immediately with the perspective and objective of proving that Christianity does harmonize and line up with the Old Testament. You have to understand something. I simply made a choice, or a series of choices, starting a few years ago and going forward, where I would not do that. I would not force the square peg into the round hole, but I would see what there was to see. And that's the difference. That's what you have to be conscious of. That's what you have to be aware of and on your guard of. Not the people like me who are willing to kick themselves in the ass, lose supporters, because they're just going to approach something honestly. You got to be very cautious of these people who will never approach these topics objectively, who never bring these things up. Now, I'm sorry, my furnace just kicked on, so I hope it's not too loud, but I'm not going to be able to sit out the 15-20 minutes that it might run for. The point is this. I know a lot of people out there, in my opinion, they have far too much faith and hope in personalities that, for one thing, they don't know. You don't know these people. None of you know these people. None of you know me. You have to be more critical of these people. You really should start in a position that is immediately critical. Don't give them the latitude that you give them. Because I'm sorry, if you do, to me, that just tells me that you're doing so because you want them to be telling the truth. Not because they are, because you want what they have to offer. You want that. You have to approach them with a far more critical attitude. And if they're just hitting very similar talking points, and if they're not coming at any of these topics from at least some kind of original point of view, which, look, I understand. We've all had our minds damaged by the never-ending stream of propaganda, the never-ending stream of talking points over every single story or event or purported event possible. We've all been damaged in that way, so I get that. And I believe that there are some people out there, and they're not going to be easy for you to find. If you find them, if you found me, it was likely on accident. That's how you're going to find the few honest people out there. And keep in mind, the few honest people out there, like myself, are going to be approaching a number of things from a very damaged, very restricted perspective. But you need to critically examine them to see if they're honest enough to approach difficult subjects, especially ones that are going to make them very unpopular. And you need to use things like that as a gauge for how you judge them, because you need to judge them. You need to judge them as rightly as you can, and you need to judge yourself as rightly as you can, too, by the way. And while you're considering the possibility that the overwhelming majority, 99 point something % of these people talking about anything, and honest to goodness, I don't care if it's flat Earth, if it's the big 1-9, if it's Tartaria, the mud flood, and the reset, which is loaded with these characters. It's loaded with them. And I didn't even get to that one. Fucking loaded with them. Same narrative. Tartaria? You fucking kidding me? Tartaria. You're calling all this old world shit Tartaria, as though there was ever even the potential for a great nation in this area they call Tartaria. We just use it, just a word. It's just a word. Well, they call it something else. Literally locking our minds half a world away in a place that has no evidence of a great kingdom ever. Reset. Reset. Like reset. It was reset. Which basically is like trimming off all the good stuff to get you down to a similar bone where you could, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, our understanding of things would have to be reset, but I mean, I don't know what that guy means when he says reset. You know, well, it was a comet. It was a comet, and the comet killed almost everybody, and we have got old books where Jesuits, they talk about the comet. Is that what you mean? The comet? And earthquakes. There's great earthquakes everywhere. New Madrid, earthquakes. And people that were left, they took over and they turned it into a completely different world. They lied to us about everything that happened. Why? Why? What were they hiding? They were hiding that a big fucking earthquake happened and killed a bunch of people? So they put a bunch of kids on trains and fucking shipped them all over the place? So they wouldn't know about the comet? And the Phoenicians that were really Irish, they couldn't have them know? Fuck me in the ear. I swear. People, do you really buy into that shit? Mud flood. It will happen because of mud. The mud. Mud flood. And you've got virtually 99 point something % of all of those people. That's all they do. Tartaria. Reset. Reset. Mud flood. Tartaria. Mud flood. Reset. And you don't think they're working off a script? Really? I've even demonstrated in other videos how completely full of shit most of the ideas regarding mud flood are. People will show pictures of buildings on an incline. Buildings on an incline. And they'll try to prove, since some of those basement windows are covered up, and since some of the first story doors are higher up than the ground, that's somehow proof of a mud flood. As opposed to somebody building a building that is plumb and level on an incline, which means that part of the first floor needs to be at about the highest point of that incline so they don't bury the first floor. And part of the basement, depending on the sharpness of the angle of the incline, is going to be exposed. Duh. But they just soldier on. They soldier on with their same script in hand. A little bit of variation here, a little bit of variation there. That's okay. Soldier on with that script in hand. And make sure that nobody is thinking about America as the land of the Bible. Sure, they may point out it's got old world features, Tartarian features. But they're not talking about, is it the land of the Bible? If they do, what do they throw in there? You know who I'm talking about. They throw in there very unrealistic ideas about who the people are we're talking about. And they also throw in all kinds of very bad establishment information, like Egypt, and comparing certain places with the actual Egypt over in the Middle East. It's really terrible stuff. I would encourage everyone, not saying that this is exactly right at all, by any stretch, I would definitely encourage everyone to watch the video. It's an episode of some kind of show that used to be on. I will put the link in the description. It was called The Newsbenders. And whatever about it may actually be right, and whatever about it may just be some very corny, over-the-top sci-fi, there is a pretty damn good deal to it that rings very reasonable and possibly very true. Not that they're controlling the things that happen or what we know about the things that happen. Not that. But that they are literally writing a script way beforehand on what's going to happen, as far as they're concerned and as far as what everybody believes. Was World War I really a world war? Was it really fought mostly in the European theater? Because even the bits and pieces that I can get from those old newspapers and magazines that I had to look at from November 23rd, 1914, let me tell you right now, for something that was supposed to only have been going on for about 3 months, and it had only been about 4 to 4.5 months since the purported assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which they say was the kickoff of all of this because of treaties and agreements and alliances between various parties, which don't make any sense either. There is even then evidence of such massive conflict the world over. Massive conflict the world over. No one could amass the kinds of armaments and troops necessary in that time to be executing such massive conflicts the world over. And that's just what's bleeding through as I have to read between the lines as I go. But consider the newsbenders, that they literally write the script before the things happen. Was there really a World War I, as we're told? Or was there just massive killing exercises the world over, including America, for the 2.5 years before they officially, according to their story, entered into the war? Every single one of these so-called conspiracy narratives, every one of them, I suggest to you, was pre-written long before they were rolled out. And the voices that they're allowing to operate, and when I say operate, I'm talking about John Levi operating, few 100,000 subscribers. He releases a video on Sunday morning, and within an hour, he has 400 comments. We love you, John. It's so great, John. You're so good, John. It's like the most boring, monotone person in the world, and his revelations aren't all that revelatory. But you don't understand. He's just a normal coffee shop owner from Salt Lake City, Utah. He's a regular guy. Do you really believe that? Based on all the evidence that you've seen around you in the world, based on research, thought, observation, or do you just want to believe that? Now, I don't have time. This is at an hour 20 already. So I don't have the time to go into comparing all these old newspapers and publications, or how they were brought to us in different forms, and all of the things that could happen from point A to point B, C, D. I mean, by now we're somewhere in the alphabet that's not that close to A. But I certainly will make a note to pick up on that as its own topic. But all in all, are we really willing to believe that there's so much wrong with our world, but when it comes to these topics, that so many people just seem to be coming to an enlightened understanding of these things all in a very short amount of time, and coming to damn near the same conclusions about them as well? Because even if it comes to something that's completely organic, the explosion at the local factory, because everybody who witnessed this is not going to have perfect information, for one thing, and secondly, is going to have a different point of view because they're an individual and have lived a different life, have had different life experiences, you're going to get in a dozen people, you're going to get a dozen very different ways of talking about that, recounting that, expressing that, feelings about that, thoughts about that. They're going to be across the board. They may all be talking about the same thing, and they may all be telling the truth from their perspective as best they can. And it's all going to be very different. There's no way you're going to see talking points to that. You may get factory, this address, explosion on maybe this day. Hopefully they'd get the day right, maybe the time, hopefully. But you're going to get such a wide array besides that. You're not going to get this horrible repetition that we see in everything rolled out there. And we always have to be very critical of every single voice out there, especially the ones who aren't willing. Not because you send them emails or anything else. How about of their own volition? Because I started down the paths that led me to where I currently am, not because of emails, because of people suggesting things, or even sometimes radically suggesting things, or, sometimes even badgering me about things. I don't usually respond to that very well. I started down these paths that ended me up where I am because I saw questions in all of these narratives that I thought, that needs an answer. That needs an appropriate answer. Nobody else is asking that question or trying to find the answer to that question. I'm gonna ask the question, and I'm gonna see if I can get the right answer or a good answer to that question. And every time I did that, it led me to where I am now. Why on earth are these thousands of others out there who are all talking in tandem, not in and of themselves by their own volition, asking those very odd though important questions and pursuing the answers to their logical ends? Something to think about. So with that, I'm going to wrap this. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for those who have supported me, who continue to, who will be supporting me more if you haven't. And you're going to buy a t-shirt, sign up at the Patreon, sponsor an episode of Briefs, send donations. It helps. It helps one of the very few people out there who is actually honestly, critically thinking about all sorts of things to keep doing that instead of losing all of his energy out doing slave jobs. Because I am doing everything I can to keep myself concentrating on being the voice of those few honest, sincere, and therefore decent people out there. That's why all the help is so meaningful. That's why it's so important. That's why it's so necessary. So with that, I'm going to call it a day. And I will see everyone next time. Take care.